Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Complexity Lounge, a meetup where we gather to talk about all things related to complexity and complex adaptive systems. I'm Jocker Selberg, and I co-host the lounge together with Barbara Frontera and Tiani Jones. Today, we welcome Matteo Mossio to the Complexity Lounge. Matteo is the Director of Research at the French National Center for Scientific Research and a full member of the Institute of History and Philosophy of Science and Technology in Paris, France. Matteo works mainly in philosophical and theoretical issues related to natural autonomy and has served as a reviewer for many international philosophical and scientific journals. In today's session, Matteo will discuss the main philosophical and theoretical tenets of autonomy theory by showing how it contrasts with the mechanistic conceptions of the life sciences. So, Matteo, welcome to the lounge.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for being here. So I'm very happy for this invitation, and I thought that it would be interesting today to give you an outline of what is autonomy theory, and so what is the very concept of autonomy applied to the life sciences. So by life sciences, I mean, of course, biology, cognitive science, and recently the theory has been applying to ecology. And one way of introducing his main tenets, also the way this theory handles with what we can call the specific complexity of living beings, is to start by contrasting it with mechanism, because this has a long and complex history in history of life science and history of philosophy. So I do like this. That's more or less my plan. I will start with describing my interpretation of what can be called the mechanistic conception of life, and then showing how autonomy theory and its main concepts that goes from individuation to organization to adaptive agency and also historicity build what I think is a coherent theory, which is actually under construction. So it's not an established theory, something which is being done right now. So what is the contrast class of autonomy theory? For me is the mechanistic conception, which traces back in the history of, as you know very well, is the history of science, at least from the scientific revolution a few centuries ago. This which is sometimes called the Clockwork Universe. So the main idea is that the mechanistic conception has to do with an analogy between living entities and machines. That's the way I understand this conception, and it is a long-lasting conception which has, as you were saying, centered on this analogy between machine and organism. So being a mechanist means some way or another believe that the analogy between organisms and machines is relevant, is explanatory. I have put here some well-known names of this or traditions of this conception. So from, of course, Descartes, and then many others authors during the last 4-5 centuries, knowing that, of course, with time and with the evolution of science, the specific content of the analogy between the organism and machine has also evolved. So from the mechanical automaton of Descartes, then at the end of the 19th century, the analogy was more replaced with the analogy with the steam machine. And then, of course, during the 20th century is the Turing machine and his concrete realization in computers that has become the main reference for mechanistic thinking. So based on this analogy, we can try to enter into some details and try to untangled with this conception. So, for instance, for Boyle, natural phenomenon, which one of the advocates of mechanicism, natural phenomena in general can be understood, understand machine, that is to say, as the result of the motion and interaction of elements and how we determine shapes and sizes. Newton has produced a mathematical grounding of this mechanical conception, and in some sense, goes with mechanicism a paradoxical analogy. The fact of try to understand natural phenomena, physical phenomena, and biological phenomena in light of the characteristics of artificial systems as machines. And of course, I didn't mention that mechanism has first emerged as a general understanding of a natural phenomena, not including physical phenomena. And if we want to try to make this a bit more precise, I suggest a specific understanding. I take mechanism as an epistemological doctrine according to which any adequate explanation of a given phenomenon, be it physical or biological, is provided, at least in principle, is not always possible to do that, by appealing exclusively to its constituents, to its parts, their properties and their interactions, which are possibly subject to natural laws. So if the parts are the molecules or are the atoms, then we are also laws under which the interaction between these components can be understood. In philosophical terms, mechanism understood that way is a specific interpretation, is a variant of the standard-oriented relation between causes and effect. Is an interpretation of the causal relations, such that the parts or the constituents are the causes, and the whole system and the phenomena that it can produce is the effect. So the first take-home message is that in mechanistic thinking, what matters most is the separation between the explanans and the explanandum. Parts are the explanans, are what explains, and the system, the whole system is the explanandum, what is to be explained. Exactly as we understand and produce machines, which are, of course, the result of the fact of assembling parts to produce a certain system that can generate certain effects and certain phenomena. So this is important because, of course, mechanism is a generic term, has become a generic term, has many meanings, can refer to different, more or less different level of phenomena in philosophy of science. Here I'm providing a categorization that I think is consistent with the origin and the main tenets of this tradition across time, but is also something that we can discuss. What are the limits of mechanism when we try to apply it to living phenomena? Because in the history of science, the question whether mechanistic thinking could be applied pertinently to explain living phenomena has always been a source of tension, also been a problem. And that's why in the history of biology, history of science, other accounts have existed. And I tend to describe the situation as if there were three doctrines, concurring doctrines, so the mechanistic the doctrine, vitalism, and organicism. And they have been more or less majority according to the moment in history, but the tendency has been to have mechanism as the mainstream conception, and vitalism or organicism as some sort of alternative accounts that try to contest some of the fundamental tenets of the theory. So concerning living phenomena, what are the limits of mechanism? And here I have put some quotation from contemporary systems biology, Jan Hendrik Hofmeyr, from the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. In a recent paper in 2017, I found some parts of this text that clearly show what can be the problem, the main problem of mechanism. So I read it. While it's perfectly possible to describe any part of a system fully in terms of its constituents only, is referring, of course, to a living system, it is impossible to understand why that part of the system has the properties that it has without considering it in the context of the intact whole system, meaning all organism. And so to this paraphrasing Dobzhansky say here, nothing is an organism makes sense except in the light of functional context. The original sentence is nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So here is putting the functional context to the foreground. And Hofmeyr is a system biologist, so he talking about himself and his colleagues. The system biology should ask not only how the parts and the interaction determine the emergent behavior of the whole, but also asking how the properties of the parts are determined context within the whole. So what is being contested here is the direction of the explanation that is supposed to go from the part to the whole and not vice versa, which is, if my reconstruction of what is mechanism correct, the main pillar of the mechanistic conception. So this kind of stance is proper to what is sometimes referred to as the organicist tradition, which is, of course, a long and prestigious tradition that somehow could be said to trace back to Aristotle, but probably the first author that has clearly elaborate in philosophical and scientific terms this conception is Kant in his third critique, the Critique of Judgment, which actually is the place where the term self-organization was first introduced. Anyone knows that this term has been invented by Kant himself. And then you have many authors, many traditions, going from philosophy to theoretical biology, including more recently people like Francisco Varela, Robert Rosen, and Stuart Kauffman. So I will mention some of them to show how they have been, in my opinion, pioneers of autonomy theory, that in some way is the contemporary heir of this organicist tradition. So just a word about Kant, because his phrasing, of course, as you know, Kant in his Critique of Pure Reasons elaborates the philosophical grounds of classical mechanics. So he believes that explanation in science have to be mechanistic. And in spite of that, Kant sees that biological system organism rise a challenge for mechanistic explanation, precisely because of the specific organized nature. So in what is called the teleological principle, he writes that we must think a living system as if it were both cause and effect of itself, which is, of course, a way of reformulating what Hofmeyr were saying before. And one interesting philosophical issue that I will touch briefly is that he immediately elaborate a connection between this kind of self-organization or circular causation between causes and effect and purposiveness and finality in a specific sense, which is immanent, and finality which is intrinsic to the system, precisely because the system is cause and effect of itself. This is a philosophical consequence that I will mention later. What Kant has in mind is that parts do not and cannot exist by themselves, but only insofar as they contribute to constituting an organized system. So the key word here is organization, which in turn is a condition of their own existence and maintenance. So believing that this kind of conception is relevant constitutes a direct criticism to the foundation of mechanism as exploratory strategy for living phenomena. Or at the very least, introduces a epistemological tension, how the two things can go together. How can we explain living system with the machine analogy if biological systems are self-organized in this sense, are cause and effects of itself. So we cannot simply start from the parts, because the parts are what they are because they are parts of a whole. They are determined by the whole. Just to mention some historical landmarks, Ludwig von Bertalanffy has also often mentioned as a advocate of the organicist tradition. And here's some quotation for way more recent, is in the 30s, his book Modern Theories of Development. A few quotations that maintain these organizational inspirations. He writes that practically all vital processes are so organized that they are directed to the maintenance, production, or restoration of the wholeness of the organism. There is no living substance, because what is characteristic of life is the organization of substances. And also a living system is a system organized in a hierarchical order of a great number of different parts, in which a great number of processes are so disposed that they, by means of the mutual relations within wide limits, with constant change of the materials and energies, constituted the system, and also in spite of disturbances conditioned by external influences, the system is generated or remains in a state characteristic of it, or these processes lead to the production of similar systems. Bertalanffy has introduced new ideas. Also the fact the system has to interact in a certain way with the external environment. So it is the idea of agency that is appearing here. I will say a word later on. And also the fact the system remains constant, keeps its identity in spite of continual material turnover. So it's changing materially while remaining the same in organizational terms. And then we arrive to the first appearance of the term autonomy used to describe this tradition. This is due to the work of Francisco Varela. He worked first in Chile and then United States, and then arrived to France. And he has left a significant heritage in Paris, actually, where he used to work. In his understanding, one of these books is Principle of Biological Autonomy, where he fundamentally says that an autonomous system, his definition corresponds to what we would call a living system. And autonomy refers to a situation in which an individual system behaves in accordance to a norm or law that it has established by itself and for itself. In this literature, there are two somehow related branches of this theory. So Varela has produced two parallel or converging accounts. In biology, we have the so-called theory concept of autopoiesis that is quite famous, so many people have heard about that. And in cognitive science is the enactivism or enactive account, stemming from different books that he have written, rather from biology or cognitive science. So there is a huge literature that is partly, I would say, in theoretical biology and partly in cognitive science. So, what is a topoiesis, which we could interpret as the contemporary interpretation of Kant's idea of self-organization. So this is a quite famous definition of the autopoietic machine. I underscore the fact that Maturana and Varela called this system a machine, which in a sense looks like a sort of paradox, given that what they want to do is precisely to oppose to a certain machine analogy. And of course, the definition is that an autopoietic machine is a machine organized as a network processes of production that through the interaction and transformation continuously regenerate and realize the network processes that produce them and constitute the machine as a concrete unity in space in which the components exist by specifying the topological domain of its realization as such of such a network. So the second condition, what they have in mind is the fact that a cell, among other things, produces a physical boundary as something that delimitates the system from the external environment while making the exchange possible. It's not just a boundary, is a functional boundary. It's something that put the cell in connection, a functional connection with the external environment. But then, and we arrive to more contemporary work. This definition looks interesting and coherent with this organicist tradition, but actually it's quite generic. And one objection that can be raised is the following. Well, there is some idea of circularity. What is at stake in this definition is the circularity and circular relation between components. They produce a system because of their mutual relations. Yes, but there are a lot of circularities in the world, not just in biology. For instance, a typical objection in the analytical philosophy literature, the water cycle or the carbon cycle or any other kind could be rephrased as if they were realizing an autopoietic system, because we can reinterpret, so make some work and say, well, this is a system where the components produce the interaction produce the components, and so on. So why not saying that the water cycle is a autopoietic system? What prevents us to say that? And in that case, should we say that the water cycle is alive, is a sort of very big and living system? Probably most people will say, well, no, we don't want to say the water cycle is a living organism. But then what's lacking in the definition? What's lacking in the theory? And actually, one could interpret the work made by more recent authors, not more recent, we are more or less in the same years, in the 70s, 80s, but Stuart Kauffman is a bit more recent, to other theoretical biologists, in particular Robert Rosen and Stewart, has tried to provide a more fine-grained characterization of this distinctive organization of autonomous system. What make this system distinctive compared, for instance, to the water cycle? We have to be, if there is a sense in which the biological system has realized a specific organization, then we have to be more specific about what kind of entities, relations, circularities are at play there. And the tendency that been elaborated is to actually distinguish between two levels, two causes, two level of causation. And say that biological systems realize at the same time a sort of causal regime of thermodynamic processes, and then a regime of constraints which are exerted on these processes. So if you want to describe what's going on in a biological organization, we have to distinguish these two kind of entities and put them together. And when we refer to biological organization, we are referring to the organization of the constraints that are at play in this system. So that's the idea. What does that mean? Just to mention that one of the main inspiration of this comes from the work of Stuart Kauffman. In particular, for me, his book Investigations have been very, very important because Stuart elaborates on the idea that when we want to make sense and describe biological complexity, we have to elaborate a framework where it results as the interplay between far from equilibrium thermodynamic processes and more stable structures, such that the system is able to self-maintain by determining some of its own condition of existence. The system has to be able to canalize thermodynamics, canalize energy and matter, so as to rebuild itself. And by relying on previous work, Kaufman links constraint and work and defines work as the constrained release of energy into relatively few degrees of freedom. And a work constraint cycle in his theory appears when, technically speaking, exergonic processes are constrained in such a way to produce the work which can be used to generate endergonic processes, which generates those constraints, which in turn allow the exergonic processes. So in the Kaufman say is work begets constraints beget work. So a living system in his theory is a system that produce works to do what? To do itself. Is a steam machine that actually produce its own structure. We have been elaborating on that. I think the idea, autonomy theory thinks that this interplay between the fact that we are far from equilibrium systems, so we are a system traversed by a flow of energy and matter, and our organization is such that it is able to canalize this energy and matter so as to build the constraints that canalize these processes. So we rebuild ourselves. The theory has tried to be very precise on how we define these concepts. And if so, the interplay is between processes and constraints. And we can say, if you look at a biological system, any kind of biological system, you can describe processes, which is any kind of physical-chemical change that involve the alteration, consumption, or production of entities. So any transformation, any transport, anything that happens in the organism. And then you have constraints, which are entities which act upon these processes by canalizing and giving them a specific direction or speed, and can be said to remain unaffected, conserved through at a given time scale. So for instance, an enzyme is a constraint that operates on chemical reactions, or at a different spatial scale, the vascular system is a big macroscopic constraint that canalizes the transport of, for instance, molecules of oxygen from one place to another in the organism. And another example is the membrane, the cell membrane, that is also a constraint that is stable. It is able to canalize the movement of particles and molecules inside the cell. So, if you think what happens in physics, then you say, well, usually in physics, constraints are introduced as external determinations, as boundary conditions or parameters, in order to adequately account for the behavior of the system. So we fix our boundary condition or parameters, and when we try to explain the dynamic that we want to explain. The whole point about looking at the work constraint cycle is saying that when we move to the biological situation, the dynamics on which the constraints act actually play a role in generating and maintaining those very constraints. So that's where the fundamental circularity is at play. Remember that what we are looking for is a specific sense of circularity, not between anything, because otherwise there are many, many things in the world that can be considered as a living system if circularity is what is most important. So here we are looking for something much more specific, is the status of constraints and where do constraints come from. And if your system can be shown to be at least partly in charge of maintaining its own constraints, then that's the Kant-Kaufman inspiration, then somehow we are dealing with a living system, which is establishing its own rules. If you want to interpret constraints as a local rules that determine the dynamics. Now, the following step is to say that, well, constraints, as the example that I've been using, or enzymes or vascular systems or membranes, are stable. That because they are stable, that they can canalize processes, but they are stable only at a certain time scale. So they are relatively short-living entities compared to the time scale of the whole organism. So at the short time scale, you can ascribe them a conservation. So the enzyme is conserved at the time scale that is relevant to describe how it can canalize a reaction. But if you wait enough time, then enzymes, as any other constraints, undergo degradation, and they must be rebuilt or replaced or repaired. That's where organization steps in. So if you go on longer time scales, constraints, biological constraints, require maintenance. And this maintenance occurs by means of another process of a complex of processes, which is itself channeled by other constraints. So that's what organization means. A system is organized when the stability of a set of constraints depends on the reciprocal effects that they collectively produce on the overall thermodynamic flow. That's what we wrote in one of our papers in 2016. At that point, we can say that the system constrains itself and contributes to determining its own condition of existence, which is a very specific thing to do, while adopting a specific behavior. So organization, this term that comes from this tradition, at least to Kant, means self-determination and means self-constraint. And with that, we try to give a specific scientific meaning to this more general idea of self-organization. Actually, there is a term that be used in the 20th century to describe this kind of regime, this kind of object. And the term is closure. Closure in the sense of a system where if you start from one node and you track the mutual dependencies, you can go back to the system. So you can follow a path of a circular path. So with my friends and collaborator Mael Monteville, we have published this paper in 2015 in the Journal of Theoretical Biology, which is called, its title is Biological Organization of Closure of Constraints, where we explicitly say that the pivotal notion of this traditionalist theory is the idea that if you want to describe biological organization, say what is specific about biological system, in what sense they realize a specific kind of complexity, then our answer is that's because they realize a closure of constraints, meaning mutual dependence between constraints defined as I mentioned above. And also one classical objection is that these ideas seems to isolate the system from the environment. Actually, this is exactly the opposite, because the idea of organizational closure goes with the idea that the system is thermodynamically open, that is interacting with the environment as to canalize this flow on energy and matter on which it depends. The question is not being independent, is being autonomous, meaning being able to use this energy and matter for a specific purpose, which is maintaining its own organization. Actually, this term of closure is used by most of these authors. Varela and Rosen and Stuart Kaufman use this word as the technical term. I will be brief on this implication. Something that we are doing more recently is also to show how this framework can guide modeling work and empirical work. So one of the problems of the organicist tradition is that it has been not very successful in elaborating specific empirical research plans or research programs. Because, of course, one of the obvious reasons is that it's difficult to deal with the organism as a whole. The complexity of our organism is such that it's difficult to say how we can study it without decomposing it, without actually adopting a mechanistic framework. So one of the important things is also making the connection between theory, philosophy, and modeling and experimental practices. And very briefly, what autonomy theory says in this respect is that for any specific biological phenomenon, the explanatory strategy consists in understanding it as a manifestation of a biological organization as defined by the theory, which creates specific guidelines. I won't discuss them in detail, but just to give you an idea, looking for closure constraints, which explain why a certain system has a certain kind of stability, means, among other things, identifying the relevant processes of transformation, the relevant timescales, identifying the constraints at different levels that act upon them, determining the dependencies between the constraints to obtain a closure, and also making time work. So describing how this kind of organized autonomous system undergo variation, because of course the idea of autonomy goes with the idea that the system undergo changes and is not always identical to himself in time. Systems evolve, although anytime they evolve, they have to find a stable configurations, a certain organization that preserve their stability. So I didn't want to enter in these details of this procedure, but just to let you know that we try also to work on the connection with empirical work. And for instance, a few years ago, with my colleagues, Leo Bick and Anna Soto, we tried to show how, for instance, interpreting glycemia regulation in terms of autonomy theory, rather than in terms of feedback loops, which is the classical way to describing these complex phenomena, actually changes, introduce a bunch of new concepts of new relations, and changes the way we see how the system actually achieves a sort of stabilization through variation. So just to give you an example of an application that we recently proposed. So I'm more or less midway. So in case there are questions about clarification at this stage, could be I could stop for a moment in case there are clarification, and I can continue on the second part. If there are no questions, I continue.
David, you seem to have put a question in the chat for Massimo. Do you want to unmute and just ask it directly?
Yeah, I can do. It was interesting. You mentioned the analytical objection, the classic analytical objection, which was that the water cycle could therefore be considered to be life, right? And you could, I assume you could scale that to stellar genesis and that sort of thing as well, like, creation of stars and then recompression of the matter into new stars, and that appearing to be a cyclic process. But that starts to give you a somewhat hylozoic view of the universe, doesn't it? Where the universe itself is alive and trying to express itself in different ways at different scales.
Yeah. So that's why I started from one one example with the case of the water cycle to see where is the fundamental problem. So if we want to say that a living system is such because it relies on specific organization, then we have to say something. And the first step consists in saying that, well, not any kind. So the first thing is, if we have life, we have circular causation. But that's not enough. The second step is circular relation between what? And so our suggestion is, well, one necessary step is that what had to be involved in this circularity are objects that fulfill the definition of constraints. So I don't give you the whole explanation of that. But so in the case of the water cycle, the carbon, or physical cycles, what happens is that those cycles are actually cycle of transformation. So it's entities that become something else under the control of external constraints, the sun, the landscape, etc., etc. So in that paper, we show that systems that looks circular are actually completely different, even though there is some circularity. So that was the first step. But it might be the case that of course, we consider larger scales, other kind of systems, as for instance Gaia, or at the level of the planet, or even larger systems, could constitute a challenge. So it might be the case that in nature we find something that satisfy the definition of a closure of constraints, and that we do not usually refer to as living. So that might be the case. As if it were the case, that would be the following challenge. So then either there is no way to limit the definition to a certain organization, or the theory has to enrich itself with new aspects. But for now, yes.
And of course, we can distinguish between biological/organic life and like the universe if we decide that also has a form of life, right? So, they are distinct. It's just kind of interesting.
Yeah. Jaco,
Okay.
do you have
I'm sorry, anything else? Does somebody have their hand up?
Yeah, maybe you're getting to this in the second half, but one of the difference is, it seems to me, is it differentiates from a water cycle is intention, or the ability to act. And the reason I'm bringing this up is, and that's autonomy, I suppose. The reason I bring it up is that at what point does a system know that it can regulate itself as a differentiator? The reason I'm bringing that up, which I don't know whether we want to go there or not, but is AI. So maybe we'll get to that later on, and maybe don't answer it now. But that's what I'm thinking when you're talking.
We do. So of course, thanks for the question. So of course, to be clear, organization is one of the pillars of the theory, not the only one. But so here is a necessary condition. And also that has something to do with artificial intelligence. So living systems have additional properties, and we'll go in some details, but those additional properties rely on the fact that they realize a specific kind of organization, which is the kind of organization that has been defined. That's how I see things. So if there are no other questions, I answer this question by moving on. When we discuss biological or living complexity, most of the time, and so here we in our institute, many times we have biologists coming to do a PhD in philosophy, because they say, well, I've been struggling all my life with teleological language, normative language. I'm a scientist. In science, this dimension should not exist. In spite of that, I all the time say, so as to, in order to, and to use normative language. So am I wrong? Where the problem is just a linguistic shortcut, and so on. So I think that purposive and normative dimension are inherent to the kind of complexity realized by biological systems. And I think the autonomy theory provides a ground for that. The first aspect is purposiveness, self-determination in the specific sense that I've been sketching. Philosophically speaking, grounds purposiveness. Because, to keep it very short, I'm sorry for that, the effects of the activity of the organization of its parts contribute to their existence. So the condition of existence of organization constitute is intrinsic telos. There is a sense in which the effects explain the cause because of the circularity, which is different from what machines do. They not directly maintain themselves. So because of this self-determination, the self there provides a grounds for purposiveness, purposiveness being final causation, where the effect explains the cause. So that's where a specific sense of purposiveness, of intrinsic to this system, can be justified. And of course, this has nothing to do with extrinsic purposiveness, which is the purposiveness where we think there's some engineer is building something because of a project or by design. It is intrinsic to any individual biological system. And this sense, by the way, this sense of purposiveness has been almost entirely lost while in the history of philosophical discussions until very recently, while Kant explicitly connects self-organization to purposiveness. But his lesson, so to speak, has been lost for a long time, and I think that is a real pity. And in a correlative way, self-determination grounds a fundamental sense of norms, of normativity, because the living organization must behave in a specific way, otherwise it would cease to exist. So the fact that some results or other products or the results are realized makes a difference for the system because of this connection between doing and being. So the intrinsic telos, its own organization, generates the norms, is a criterion to determine the norms of the activity of the organization and these constraints. So there is a sort of conceptual implication between grounding a notion of purposiveness into organization and then be able to say, well, then the system has to do this rather than that, otherwise it would disappear. And so the normativity emerges from this asymmetry between states in the world which are under the control of the system. It is not the same if I behave this way or the other way, because in the first case I survive, the other way I disappear. So it makes an existential difference. Those two notions allow a justification of the idea of function, which is actually a notion with which biologists tend to struggle, because they sense that saying that the purpose of the function of the heart is to pump blood, they sense that I'm saying something like the heart has to do that. And is there because it pumps blood, so they are not at ease with that. But actually, in this framework, functions can be very straightforwardly defined as the constraint exert in a system. So the vascular system exerts a constraint in the system. Result is that the system is maintained, and the maintenance of the system maintains the vascular system. So the function, this is the function of the vascular system because it contributes to the overall purposiveness of the system. So there's the notion of purposiveness, normativity, and function go together, are defined in the same framework. And so these are philosophical implications of this theory that again deal with concepts that seems to be fundamental in biological sciences, but as a unclear status. It's unclear whether these notions, all these dimensions, are legitimate or not. And I think that they are, provided that we provide the relevant grounding. And it could also be argued that this idea organization provides a criteria to individuate systems. So what is an individual, a biological individual? Well, his boundaries are the boundaries of biological organization, the boundaries of this organization which is able of self-determination. So what is part of me is what operates so as to maintain itself and therefore to maintain the part itself. So everything that is subject to closure is part of the individual. So for instance, I can eat something, but what I eat is not part of myself because I'm not maintaining something on which I depend, by the way, but is not maintained by my interaction. So organization, functionality, individuation, those notions go together in this approach and actually are interdefined. That brings me to Joko question. Autonomy implies a notion of interaction, because as I was saying in the beginning, it actually implies an interactive dimension. Because of for the first fundamental reason is the thermodynamic openness. We depend on interaction with the external environment, with the fact that we are able to get enough energy and matter from the external environment. So we must maintain what Varela and Maturana had called a coupling, an adequate coupling with the environment. And this interaction is active in the sense that how do we manage this interaction? Actually, we exert constraints on the external environment. We manage to canalize, to orient the flows, the external flows, for instance, of food or etc., so as that they can contribute to our maintenance, to preserve our identity as organized systems. And some of the advocates of autonomy theory here, some of the group of San Sebastian in the Basque Country in Spain, has actually defined agency in those terms. An organized system is necessarily an agent, meaning by agent, a system that is able to exert constraints, exert a causal action of the external environment so as to contribute to maintain its own condition of existence. It is a very minimal, fundamental sense of agency. It doesn't imply intentions, but it does imply orientation, so purposiveness, normativity, and functionality. But it's supposed to apply to any kind of biological system, even though, for instance, for any kind of bacteria or minimal living system, even though we don't necessarily want to apply them intentions. Because what we are looking is how this behavior is connected to a network of dependencies. And as I was saying, an agent, a biological agent, is a system that performs actions. And by actions, I mean a subset of functional constraints, or any kind of functions of the system, but which are specific in this, that they exert the effects on the boundary condition of the whole system, on the external environment. So an action is a function exerted on the environment, and that whose fundamental purpose is to maintain the agent. And given that they are functions, as any other functions, they are subject to the purposiveness and normativity of the whole organism that flows from the definition. So that's why the action can be successful or not, depends if they comply with the norms of the maintenance of the system. And just to mention the fact that autonomy theory has also elaborate on an additional aspect, the fact that actions are not just are not fixed, but they can be modulated. That is what Ezequiel Di Paolo, which is also a theoretical biologist of the San Sebastian, has added the fact that agency is adaptive, so is able to modify autonomous system, able to modify the behavior or the organization according to perturbation, so as to maintain the organization. So any living system is able to regulate his own organization or his actions, so as to maintain, because evolutionarily speaking, living systems live in changing environments, so they must be able to adapt to this changing environment to maintain themselves. So what is this dimension? So what is adaptivity? An adaptive system, I was saying, modifies his organization or his behavior or both. This implies normative, the notion of regulation, and we wrote a paper where we try to define what is regulation in autonomy theory. And we can say that actually this capacity to modify its own organization can be understood as a second order functional capacity, second order constraints. The result of these ideas is a sort of definition of what is an autonomous system. So a sort of preliminary definition would be that an organized adaptive agent is an autonomous system, an autonomous natural system, and so something very close to a definition of a living system. And this activity is governed by the norms established by its overall self-determining organization. That's why it is autonomous, self-law. Law being the constraints, the local rules which are established and maintained by the system itself. And that set of ideas were recapitulated into the book that I wrote with my friend and colleague Alvaro Moreno 10 years ago now. Wow, time flows. Now, a couple of slides to conclude. Autonomy in this the science's definition, it manifests itself in all variety of adaptive actions performed by living systems with the goal of self-determining. So it can be things like chemotaxis, the fact that bacteria are able to change their behavior because they are following a gradient, a chemical gradient. They can change the behavior if the gradient changes. Of birds that are that are modifying the environment and produce nest for the offspring, or even collective and communication behavior, as in eusocial animals like ants or bees, where we can understand what they are doing as the fact of elaborating very complex organization, collective organization, which where there are functions and division of labor, but always, even though the level is different, satisfying the definition of organization and autonomy. So is a wide variety of phenomena that can be put together into a coherent theoretical schema, I think. And one last word is to mention something that my colleague Maël Monteville thinks is works a lot in his research, is the fact that there is an intimate connection, of course, between autonomy, evolution, and variation. Autonomous systems are very, very complex systems, so they are not, and probably they cannot be spontaneous in a trivial sense. By the way, the term self-organization now has become a misleading one, because self-organization today has changed, is used in a different discipline, is used in physics and in Fraunhofer equilibrium physics, where precisely it refers to systems that are spontaneous. So, for instance, a tornado or a candle can be something that can be produced spontaneously, even though we do not have a similar system that has produced it. In biology, autonomy not supposed to be like that. The complexity of living system is fundamentally the result of evolution, be it by natural selection or other processes. But at the same time, autonomous systems are agents. So among other things, they modify the environment, they modify adaptive pressures. So the general picture that emerges from this theory is that, as I write there, evolution shapes autonomy, of course. Autonomous systems are historical systems. They come from other autonomous systems. But on the other side, autonomy shapes evolution, specifically through adaptive agency and organizational constraints. So the theoretical relation between evolution and autonomy are very, very complex, also very intimate, and I would even say circular in a sense, but in an epistemological sense. And the last word is also that that will be a completely independent talk to mention that the fact that autonomous systems are specific in the fact that they build and control some of their condition of existence, in particular their own constraints, make that they actually are able to generate unpredictable variation, which makes a huge difference with physical systems, where the set of possible outcomes is usually defined in an initial phase space. So this is something on which Mael and also Stuart Kaufman had worked recently, saying that what is specific to biological system is the fact that they can vary in a way that cannot be predicted. And I make the connection between this property and the fact that systems are autonomous, in the sense that they not just obey to law, but they also build their own local law by generating and maintaining their own local constraints. So not only there is a connection between autonomy and evolution, but this picture is made more complex by the fact that also the kind of variation that autonomous systems can undergo depends also on their own organization. So the work toward us is to make more clear and more elaborate the relation between evolution, variation, and autonomy. And with that, I stop. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Matteo. That was awesome. All my favorite words in one place. This is great. Of course, in the chat, various things have come up. Panpsychism was briefly mentioned.
Sorry, do you want me to stop sharing or?
Yeah, if you could stop sharing your screen so I can see everyone, that would be great. Okay, so I know that David has had various questions in the chat. And Rebecca, was that a question or a statement that you made?
It was a statement.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, because there was a lot of back and forth about modify and things like that. David, do you want to open up and ask your series of questions here about self? I like the one about self-organization versus.
Yeah, so you touched on it. When you touched on it, I did wonder, has he actually read this comment and is responding to it? So it might be parts of this, but my question was, can we explore self-determination versus self-organization versus self-management, possibly versus autonomy? But you did kind of touch that with the concept of spontaneous generation as opposed to, I suppose, generation with telos.
Yeah. Okay. I will talk not too long. Yeah. So self-organization is an interesting story. So the term was invented by Kant to describe living systems, but now has a completely different meaning. So it's in physics. So among other things, is also there is two terms in physics: self-organization and self-assembly. And so there is a quite complex story. But for me, self-organization, I'm not using it anymore in biology because it refers to tornadoes. It refers to far from equilibrium systems that somehow are able to appear from scratch, and according to some description, not even to all physical description, are able somehow to maintain themselves. But they are spontaneous. So they are simple. And my conjecture is that what they do is that at best you can define one constraint, one macroscopic constraint that maintains the flow. But apart from that, we push that term out. Otherwise, it doesn't mean that we are not dissipative systems. We are also dissipative systems, of course, but of a different kind. We are organized. And so there the contrast is between this and being historical, being the result of evolution, the accumulation of complexity through evolution. Self-determination is more specific, and it means that the system, because it's constraining a condition of existence, it's, technically speaking, contributing to determining its own condition of existence. And that, for me, is more specific to what this tradition has in mind. We control some, not all, some of the conditions that make us alive. So that's why I use self-determination of self-organization. And one self-maintenance, for instance, is also something that's being used. But the problem, so it's true that we self-determine, and the result of that is we self-maintain. We do not die. But that's a bit tricky because self-maintenance doesn't make room to variation. Seems to mean that we maintain ourselves in a sort of homeostatic case, which is not the case. So we undergo variation even when we are adults, etc. So self-maintenance is quite relevant, but doesn't catch the variation part, which is still, of course, at play, not only during development, but also at the adult stage. So sometimes you can see that word in this literature, sometimes not. Self-determination looks to me a bit more general and doesn't introduce this misunderstanding according to which the theory would not consider time, which is not the case. The time and then variation.
Fab, thank you.
Hey, who's next? Come on, I see some stuff in here, but I don't know how to formulate it as questions.
Okay, I'll go with it. A question about awareness versus autonomy, which, and I don't think awareness has anything to do with autonomy. But awareness does have a function in some aspect of higher level organizations. So maybe you could talk about that a bit.
Yeah. This is related to the existence of this distinction between the more theoretical biology-oriented literature and the more cognitive science literature. Mm-hmm. So an activist tradition so the question about awareness of cognition is more in that tradition. Of course, there is a huge problem because how do we know, how we can test the fact that certain organism is aware? So it's unclear. But what I can tell you is that in the way where awareness is treated is in connection, for instance, in the Basque Country, in connection to the role of the nervous system. So they do not define what awareness is, but they think that this has something to do with the fact that an organism has or this complex infrastructure, which is the nervous system, which enables some dynamical uncoupling between the metabolism and the physiology and the nervous system, that we can operate in a less connected way, so it can do other things. So what they say is that maybe we have to elaborate more on the functioning of the nervous system to make sense of very specific capacities, cognitive capacity, including the fact of being aware. But I think that what they have in mind is that if we are aware of ourselves, we need to introduce some kind of distinction. There must be a system, a subsystem that is in charge of being aware of another system. And the candidates are the nervous system, which in part is simply performing metabolic functions, and in part is performing cognitive functions, including this capacity for awareness. But it would be consistent with the fact that awareness has a function. So there is not clear how exactly the theory would make us allow us to make progresses in understanding the nature of awareness, which is a huge philosophical problem.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. That was great. It's interesting for me, like listening to this, the mechanistic model is so ingrained in the way that, we think of the world really in general. And the problem I always face is that in trying to introduce, more sort of biological or organic ideas, is that it always bangs up against that mechanistic model. And even when they go, oh yeah, this is great, let's but then, boom, how do we measure? How do we productivity is all. And so it's been very interesting to listen to this talk and think about how this applies to some of the work that I do, and what might or might not work. Surgeon, did you have your hand up? Yes. And did I pronounce your name correctly?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Yay.
If we accept that every living being is a kind of autonomy, biological system, what is your thought about the question that progress in modern medicine bring on the table, like artificial leg or artificial heart? Can we preserve those clear boundary between those parts, even if there are essential ones?
So, yes. Can I start from the Barbara's question? So it was a comment, but actually I have something to say, because when I criticize the mechanistic thinking, is a criticism in the sense, is the philosophical sense, not to say that this is stupid or make no sense. Actually, it's all the contrary. There is huge historical and even say cognitive reasons why humans have tended to be mechanistic in most of this scientific history. Because one reason is that we understand what we can build. And what we can do is machines. So we hope that if living system, at least in part, resemble machines in their organization, then we have some hope to understand something. So we are homo faber, so we make things, and I think that it's very difficult to overcome the mechanistic way of thinking, because it's very deeply rooted in, I think, our cognitive dimensions or skills or whatever. So, and also because it's very difficult to say, well, how can we study whole system, complex system at once? Is also a practical question. So the automatic answer is, well, we have to decompose. We have to open the system to try to understand something. The problem is that living systems react to that. So if you just open system, you pick the parts, you are altering the system. So you think to understand how genes work without putting genes into a cell and into an organism, you are not understanding what's going on. So we made a lot of mistakes about who is doing what in genetics, because we thought that the genes were just the causes of the phenotype, while it's way more complex than that. You see, but the problem is that how do we study complexity if we cannot simplify it? So organicism and autonomy has to face a huge challenge, because there is good reasons to be mechanistic in practical terms. You see, so it's a very complex, interesting question in my opinion. And so concerning artificial, the connection between natural and artificial, actually, I don't think that it makes a fundamental difference, in the sense that I have an understanding of humans as inherently technical. So humans produce artifacts from the very beginning, and we depend on artifacts. So in a sense, it doesn't mean that these are parts in the same sense that our organs are. So there is a conceptual difference. But overall speaking, we produce artifacts and we depend on artifacts. So the fact that to a certain degree we can replace, for instance, natural arts with artificial arts doesn't mean that we are not autonomous, which autonomous doesn't mean independent, mean that we establish our own rules. So for me, it's a question of more or less. We can be more or less autonomous depending to what extent we depend on artifacts or depend on other living systems and so on. So for me, it's not a yes or no question to that. Of course, there is a limit. There is a bottom limit. If I'm not able anymore to perform a metabolism, so I'm not a living system, but I can still describe a closure and an agent, even though parts of my function are delegated to an external entity. So you see, I see it as a quantitative issue more than a yes or no one. I don't know if answer your questions or if you disagree. Please disagree.
Do you disagree, Sergeant?
Actually, I'm not sure. I don't know how to explain, but if those parts are essential in a sense that actually everything depends on that, I think that, and that the rest of the system is still biological. It's difficult for me to say that it is not a big issue. So I don't know if I'm clear enough.
But I think about the fact that, for instance, I live in a house here, and if actually I'm in the mountains, so if I had to live outside, I would instantaneously die this night. So I'm autonomous in a certain context, that I depend on artifacts that I'm not depend on me. I'm unable to build a house. So what is interesting, you say, I understand your point. I mean, it's relevant, but the fact is that it looks like if the artifact is inside me, topologically speaking, it makes a difference. Maybe or maybe not, because maybe the artifact is outside and is actually the same story. I cannot live without house. I can live, and I guess I cannot live with the telephone anymore. So.
Thank you.
I see. I understand your point, but not sure that the fact that we are talking about organs changes the question that in any case we depend on a technological environment.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Okay. What else we got here? Okay, David, you brought up post-humanism, so now you have to ask. Come on, you know you want to.
Sorry, which one?
Well, the last one was talking about post-humanism, so.
Yeah. So this is sort of following up from. I'm so sorry, I don't know how to say it yet. this is sort of a post-humanist argument, right? Because like, how is the artificial heart different to me wearing glasses, which I'm wearing at the moment? Because I depend on that in order to interact with my environment and survive. How is it different to the way a car becomes an extension of my nervous system when I'm driving? How is it different to me having a notebook that I write stuff in so that I don't have to remember everything, right? It's a very post-humanist, where's the balance between artificial, between tool and human, right?
Yeah. So that put that way, the answer coming from autonomy theory is more straightforward, because the glasses that you are wearing do not depend on you. So there is no mutual dependence with that. So there is a dependence between glasses in general and a certain social organization. So to explain why glasses exist, unless you have produced your own glasses alone, it is a sort of artifacts are social organs. But at your scale, there is a difference between your notebook, your telephone, and your glasses, and your lungs, because there is these artifacts are not subject to closure. So if you take them and put on the table, they will last probably even longer than if compared if you use them, which is exactly the contrary than the biological organ. So that in that sense, there is the analyzing the organization and the mutual dependencies between the parts can allow to distinguish between what is part of the individual and what are extensions of the individual I think in a quite clear way in that sense.
It's intrinsic versus an extrinsic relationship almost.
Yeah, so they have a function, but they are not produced by you, they are produced by society. At the scale of the society, you can say that, well, no, they are parts of the social system because they contribute to the social system and they are produced by the social system. So at that scale, those artifacts are organs in a sense, and I would be ready to accept it. But at the scale of individual, you can still make the difference, theoretically speaking, between your arm and your glasses, I think.
Cool. Rebecca.
Yeah, so having this on my on my desk here, one of the things that I find fascinating to think about in a philosophical sense as well, biological sense, is symbiotic relationships. Like my biome is not it is made up of many things. And it's like there's a constrained, I don't know, say the constraints seem to be mutual rather than individualistic. So maybe you could talk a bit about those kind of things.
Thanks. That's very interesting. So I see of two possible cases. The simple one is I would say in English, the macrobiome. In that case, I would treat it as a function, as an organ, because actually, if you look at the description of an autonomous system in terms of the mutual dependencies, it doesn't matter where the parts come from. So there is good reason to think that many of these parts have to be the result of a differentiation process during embryogenesis, otherwise there would be no coherence. But once you have that system, actually part of the function are performed by microbes, etc. And there is mutual dependence. I depend on them and they depend on me. So for me, the microbiota is just exerting as a whole one of different functions for digestion, for etc., and I don't see any problem in treating them as functional parts. So they collectively exert a constraint because, for instance, they help digesting, so they are constraining a process, for instance, of digestion. So for me, the idea of the holobiont, maybe you have heard of this notion, it captured by the theory by saying, well, we are a collection of living entities that actually realize a single organization. Okay. A different story is when I have a symbiotic relation with one other organism. That's a bit more tricky, because in that case, suppose the mycorrhiza case of the tree and the fungi. So they interact, but in that case, suppose that I am a symbiotic relation with one other organism. So we share some functions, and there it might be tricky to decide whether we have two individuals or one single autonomous system if I'm sharing one function with them, because we are just two, so we are at the same level. I can treat the microbes as collectively as an organ. But if I'm interacting with someone, we have written about that, and our solution is that when we have a symbiotic relation between two individuals, that happens with fishes, etc. Actually, the complexity stays with the two symbionts. They usually share just a few functions. So you can still, if you measure the organized complexity based on autonomy, the autonomy is huge with me and the other living system, and then we share a few functions. So given that, theoretically speaking, we can still draw a line and say, well, the individuals are the two interacting entities because they are very complex. And they just, but it is true that in principle, there is a sort of general organization links them. Yeah. But it doesn't mean that we cannot distinguish, theoretically speaking, the two interacting systems if we measure the complexity.
Thank you.
David, do the finger wiggles mean you have a question? Yes, you do. You raise your hand. Okay, David.
That was me raising my hand. I was like super important.
Okay, I was like, what's going on there? What's happening?
So that's really interesting, because that reminds me of, I think it was Deleuze and Guattari who discussed the symbiosis between the wasp and the orchid, right? And there needs to be kind of a mutual presupposition of differentiation between them. So, if the orchid changes its presentation in some way, then the wasp also needs to change either its response or the way it presents in order to transfer the pollen between plants. So, sorry, that was just, as you were answering, I was like, oh my God, this actually applies to something else. And that's kind of like the mutual presupposition, and that mutual differentiation, I think, really becomes part of the problem, because you were talking about historicity. And of course, we're not really talking about a single line of historicity.
Right.
Talking about divergent lines which still remain in parallel and have strong relationships between them.
Yeah, I agree. A general comment is that, of course, one of the classical criticism that is made to this kind of theory is that they put too much emphasis on the individual, not enough on the interactions. I understand the worry, but I think it is not well grounded, because of course we have to make sense of interactions, and life is interactions, is many interactions at any kind of level, as the one that you were mentioning. The problem is that if you do not have a theory that gives you a stable notion of who is interacting, you are talking about nothing. So I'm very critical about this sort of, it's not what you're saying at all, but I mean, just make me think about the fact that, interactionism is complexity is interaction. Yes, but you need a theory that set the stage. What kind of entities, what is your ontology made of? Who is interacting and why? With that, we can enter into complex question about, where does this individual ends and the other starts if they interact very much and the interaction is very tight? That is a relevant question. Just to situate myself in this debate.
I'm spending a lot of time in ontology at the moment, so yeah, that makes complete sense because the question is really what exists, and then and then you kind of have to derive your epistemology, what you can know about what exists from that. Otherwise, you're just going to end up in in philosophical nightmareville.
Good.
Sorry. Well, please.
Good, because I can use that as a jumping off point to do what I always want to do, which is jump over to AI. So as we're looking at machines and computers and all that kind of stuff, which we can think of as mechanisms, right? And they're all now in the cloud, and they're increasing degrees of sophistication of these machines. They are beginning to, piece by piece, take on similarities to some of the properties that you are ascribing to life. And it's not happening all at once. It's just happening in sort of things that are similar to, which is why I was interested in some of it. I like the way that you'd built this whole thing up, right? And at what point do these machines actually take on enough characteristics of life that, without getting all Philip K. Dick on everybody, at what point is it enough that we have to start to ascribe rights and things like that to it? Not that we're anywhere near that now, but to sum up, all the stuff that you're talking about with biological systems and all of that, and to differentiate from, say, water systems and all that, has been very useful. But now we have a new character entering in here where we sort of have to modify all of the definitions we've used before, because it's kind of radically different. I'm just looking for a comment on all of that, I think.
So the question is when Kubrick's Space Odyssey will become real.
Not quite that far, but yeah. When can we say that it is autonomous? Really?
Yeah. Well, what's the name of the computer? HAL, right?
HAL. Yeah. HAL.
I am not at all an expert in artificial intelligence, but if I follow my theory in a coherent way, I have to say that the only way a machine can become a sort of living system is the day when he will realize a closure, meaning that this machine is maintaining physically itself. So we have to enter into a situation where there is no difference between the hardware and the software, framed in terms of contemporary machines. So if your software, what you are talking about is the software. So software is very complex, is more and more complex. Algorithms are able to perform tasks more and more complex, but this isn't at all relevant for the relation with the hardware. So the machine has to have a purpose. And if we follow this theory, having a purpose means being a system that is self-determining as a physical system in the world. And then it would be a purpose, it would be norms, it would be etc. It would be needs, it would have needs, etc., etc. All these dimensions depend on the fact that your system has a very specific relation between doing and being, which is not the case for a machine. And the question is, yes, they could do that. Yes, but the question that I would ask is, why would they do that? Why would a software at some point feel the necessity to be in charge of its own self-determination? So I cannot exclude that this can happen, of course, but it's a bit complex to imagine the situation where an object that has no purpose, intrinsic purpose, would suddenly look for that, unless we do that. Unless
I think the
living system. Unless
the challenge is we tend to think that it's either one or other, that it's jumped the shark or whatever you want to call it into suddenly having all these rather than having pseudo properties of them, such as when life was originally forming just before it was life, but something more than not life. And so, but now we tend to categorize it as one or the other. It's either live or it's not, and we fight about that. But as it's evolving, it takes on pseudo properties that look a lot like it, but aren't quite there yet.
But I think that they are not evolving. I think that we are changing them.
Right.
So we are
They're beginning to evolve, though.
more evolving in the computational space, but not as physical machines. That they are not evolved. We modify them because we change the way we produce computers, or et cetera, et cetera. So the question for me would be: would we at some point decide to build a living system? Or if that's the question, so decide that we try to build a computer that actually is in charge of maintaining and reproducing itself materially. Yes, maybe, but the question is, why would we do that?
We're crazy because we can.
In other terms, I think that this is under our control. We have to decide one day to build something that is actually an autopoietic thing. But we have to decide to do that. The machines are not going to do that alone because they have no purpose in the Kant sense. They have no purpose. What they do is irrelevant for what they do. They would exist independently. So there is no relevance that is given by the self-determination of the system. That's what life consists in. A machine, whatever the result, is still there. So this telephone can fail in calling you. It doesn't disappear for that very reason. While if I fail significantly to feed myself, I will disappear. So I have a relation with what I do with the external world, which is very specific, given by my self-determination. And for me, this is not what machines do, or even artificial intelligence. So I translate your question in that sense. Would we one day decide to build a living system? The answer is probably yes, but that's something that we decide to do, I think. I don't believe too much that the evolution of software can result into pseudo life properties in a strong sense. For me, there is a jump, because you have to jump from the computational space to the material space. And it's a bit difficult to me to figuring out how that could happen, actually, if alone. But maybe, I mean, that's a vague thought.
Yeah. No, I like the differentiation in terms of the ability for it to physically build itself. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on in AGI right now, so I'll leave it at that. But at some point, that's something where biology is going to have to go, I think, is my overarching point, whether they want to or not.
I see. Well, let's meet in 2,000 years and let's check who's right.
It might only be 5, my friend.
David, I like your comment that like the black box aspect of all of these algorithms means that they are by definition disconnected from human systems. That's my understanding of your comment? And yeah, I think that really encapsulates some of that really well. You know, the idea that they are tools because they are disconnected. We are using them and they are disconnected from our systems when we are not using them.
It's for me, or sorry, or
yeah. I just was reading. David made this comment in the chat while that conversation was going on, and I thought it was a very interesting way of encapsulating the discussion.
Yeah,
I keep thinking of Heidegger and that damn hammer.
you can't stop thinking of Heidegger. Let's be honest. But that wasn't necessarily sarcasm, by the way.
Getting harder to tell.
Yeah, I sort of extended that thought because I have read too many dissertations from students recently which were produced by exosystems rather than their own cognitive faculties. And that's interesting because it's almost like that is becoming, instead of extending cognition, which, like, you know, there are many tools that we use to extend our cognition, we end up with people, almost sublimating their own cognition to it, and it becomes subservient to a magical statistics machine that just poops out rubbish. And there we go. So yeah, really, I was ranting about my students rather than making a profound problem. But there you go.
Consider it a Turing test that you run every day.
Oh, and that's the thing, right? Like, so I've brought it up here before, but the example I have was the student who wrote a whole dissertation about circles of relatives organizations, right? And I spent the first chapter of this really confused about what they were talking about, but it turned out they meant like family companies or family businesses. And it rendered by ChatGPT throughout as circle of relatives organizations. And as a result, it sort of lost all meaning, because like family business is like it's a symbol on its own. And so it lost.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, does anyone else have any questions or comments before we release Matteo from this this grilling? Anyone? Going once? I mean, David, I know you could go on all day, but we have to draw a line under it somewhere. Anyone else? No? Okay, well, if that's the case, then Matteo, I cannot thank you enough. This has been wonderful.
It was great. Thank you.
I've enjoyed it so much, and really that's really all that matters. And you are welcome back anytime. Please, any new work you want to share with us, just let us know. And thank you to all of you for hanging in there with us and participating in this event. And we have some other great events coming up in June and through the summer. So stay tuned and watch your inbox for the meetup announcement. So thank you very much, and bye, everyone.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for the questions. It's very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.